The station was nearly deserted, a lonely outpost under a starless sky. The old-fashioned clock above the platform ticked steadily toward midnight, its hands moving with an ominous certainty. A chilly wind swept through the station, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and something else, something metallic and unsettling. Clara clutched her ticket tightly, glancing nervously at the few other passengers scattered across the platform. An elderly couple murmured quietly to each other, their faces shadowed and unreadable. A man in a long coat and hat stood apart, his eyes fixed on the distant tracks. Clara shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. She was used to traveling alone, but tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, an almost palpable sense of foreboding. The train arrived with a mournful whistle, its black silhouette emerging from the darkness like a ghostly serpent. The doors hissed open, and Clara hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The interior was surprisingly warm, the lighting soft and dim. She found her compartment easily, a small, cozy space with a window overlooking the shadowy landscape. As the train lurched forward, Clara settled into her seat, trying to shake off her unease. She pulled out a book, hoping to distract herself, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. The world outside was a blur of dark shapes and fleeting lights, and the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks was oddly soothing. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the conductor, a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. His uniform was immaculate, but there was something old-fashioned about it, as if he belonged to another era. "Ticket, please," he said, his voice low and raspy. Clara handed over her ticket, trying to muster a polite smile. The conductor examined it closely, then handed it back with a nod. "You're in for a long journey, miss," he said, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "This route has a history, you know, a tragic one." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The conductor glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Years ago, there was an accident. A terrible one. A train derailed on this very route and many lives were lost. Some say the spirits of those who perished still linger, searching for closure." He tipped his hat and moved on before Clara could ask any more questions. She watched him disappear down the corridor, her mind racing. She had heard stories of haunted places and restless spirits, but she had never given them much thought. Now, alone in her compartment with the darkness pressing in, the idea seemed all too real. The train sped onward, the landscape outside growing more desolate and strange. Clara could feel the tension in the air, a creeping unease that made her skin prickle. She tried to return to her book, but the words swam before her eyes, refusing to make sense. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the train gave a violent shudder. Clara's heart pounded as she clung to her seat, the fear rising like a tide. The lights steadied, but the sense of dread remained, heavier than ever. She glanced at the window and gasped. Outside, barely visible in the murky darkness, was the faint outline of another train running parallel to theirs. It was an old-fashioned locomotive, its carriages dark and silent. For a moment, Clara thought she saw faces in the windows, pale and staring, but then it was gone, swallowed by the night. Clara's breath came in short, panicked bursts. She knew then that this was no ordinary journey. The past was reaching out to them, and the midnight departure was only the beginning. The train pressed onward through the night, its steady rhythm a haunting lullaby against the oppressive silence. The desolate landscape outside seemed to stretch endlessly, a vast expanse of darkness punctuated only by the occasional flicker of distant lights. Clara couldn't shake the image of the ghostly train from her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the pale faces staring back at her, their expressions frozen in a silent scream. She decided to explore the train, hoping movement might dispel the growing unease. She stepped into the narrow corridor, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The train swayed gently, the motion both soothing and disorienting. She passed compartment after compartment, most of them dark and empty. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of other passengers through the small windows, faces drawn and tense, eyes wide with an unspoken fear. As she reached the end of the carriage, she noticed a door slightly ajar. Curious, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small and dimly lit, filled with an assortment of old, dusty objects. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with forgotten belongings. A broken pocket watch, a child's toy, a tattered book. At the center of the room stood an antique writing desk, its surface covered in yellowed papers and faded photographs. Clara's eyes were drawn to a leather-bound journal lying open on the desk. The pages were filled with neat, flowing script, detailing the tragic events of the fateful accident years ago. She read with growing horror about the train that had derailed on this very route, the screams of the passengers, and the flames that consumed the wreckage. The author of the journal spoke of restless spirits, unable to move on, haunting the tracks in search of justice. A sudden noise made Clara jump. She spun around to see the elderly couple standing in the doorway, their faces pale and fearful. "We heard something," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "Whispers, crying. It sounded like children." Clara's blood ran cold. She had heard it too, the faint echoes of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The couple stepped inside, their eyes darting around the room as if expecting to see the spirits themselves. "We need to find out what happened," the man said, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. "There must be something in this journal that can help us understand." Together, they pored over the journal, piecing together the fragments of the past. They read about the passengers who had perished in the crash, their lives cut tragically short. The names and faces became hauntingly real, their stories a somber reminder of the lives lost. As they read, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. She glanced around, half expecting to see ghostly figures emerging from the shadows. "We need to leave," the woman said urgently, her eyes wide with fear. "This place isn't safe." But Clara was reluctant to go. There was something compelling about the journal, a sense that it held the key to understanding the strange events unfolding around them. She turned to the last entry, her breath catching in her throat as she read the final desperate words of the author. "They won't rest until they find peace. They need someone to listen, to understand their pain. Only then can they move on." The words seemed to echo in the small room, a plea from beyond the grave. Clara closed the journal, her mind racing. The spirits of the past were reaching out to them, seeking justice for the wrongs done to them. As they left the room, the whispers followed them, growing fainter but no less eerie. Clara knew they had to find a way to uncover the truth about the accident, to give the restless spirits the closure they needed. The train continued its journey through the night, the echoes of the past growing ever stronger. Clara and her newfound companions were determined to unravel the mystery, unaware of the dangers that lay ahead. The train roared through the night, its iron wheels cutting through the darkness with an unrelenting rhythm. Clara, the elderly couple, and a few other passengers gathered in the dimly lit dining car, their faces reflecting the collective unease that had settled over them. The journal lay open on the table, a tangible link to the tragic past they had just begun to uncover. Clara glanced around the room, noting the haunted expressions of those present. Each person had experienced something unsettling, Whether it was the whispers, the fleeting shadows, or the sudden cold spots that seemed to follow them, the sense of dread was growing stronger, an invisible weight pressing down on them all. "We need to stick together," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "Whatever is happening, we can't face it alone." The elderly couple nodded in agreement. The man, who had introduced himself as Henry, cleared his throat. "We should start by examining the train. There must be more clues, more connections to the accident." The others murmured their assent, and they split into pairs to search different parts of the train. Clara found herself teamed with Henry's wife, Margaret, a kind woman with a surprisingly resolute demeanor. They made their way down the narrow corridors, peering into empty compartments and checking for anything out of the ordinary. As they approached the end of one carriage, Clara noticed a door she hadn't seen before. It was slightly ajar, the space beyond it cloaked in darkness. She pushed it open cautiously, revealing a small compartment that seemed untouched by time. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight, and the air was heavy with the scent of mildew. "This must be one of the older compartments," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at these belongings. It's as if they were just left here. Forgotten." Clara stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping over the abandoned items. There were suitcases covered in dust, old clothing hanging limply from hooks, and a child's teddy bear lying forlornly on a seat. Her eyes were drawn to a photograph pinned to the wall, its edges yellowed and brittle. It showed a family, mother, father, and 2 children, smiling brightly at the camera, unaware of the tragedy that awaited them. "These must have belonged to the passengers who died in the crash," Clara said softly, a lump forming in her throat. "Their lives, their stories, all cut short." Margaret picked up the teddy bear, her eyes misting with tears. It's heartbreaking to think of what they went through. No wonder their spirits are restless. As they continued to explore the compartment, Clara found another journal, smaller than the first but filled with similar entries. It was a child's diary, the pages filled with innocent musings and drawings. The last entry was particularly poignant, describing a trip they were taking as a family, filled with excitement and hope. "We have to bring these back to the others," Clara said, her voice trembling. "They need to see this." Margaret nodded, and they carefully gathered the items, making their way back to the dining car. The others were already there, their faces pale and anxious. Henry and the other passengers listened intently as Clara and Margaret recounted their discovery, passing around the diary and photograph. "This confirms it," Henry said grimly. "The spirits are trying to communicate with us. They want us to know their story." As they discussed their next steps, the lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The temperature dropped suddenly, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She turned to see a ghostly figure standing at the edge of the room, a young girl, her eyes wide with sorrow. The apparition seemed to reach out, her lips moving as if trying to speak. Clara took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you want?" she whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. The girl faded, her form dissolving into the darkness, but her presence lingered, a silent plea for help. Clara knew then that their journey was far from over. The haunted compartment had revealed the depths of the tragedy, but it was only the beginning. The spirits needed them to uncover the full truth, to right the wrongs of the past. As the train hurtled onward, the passengers braced themselves for the horrors yet to come, bound together by a shared determination to bring peace to the restless souls haunting the ghostly train. The night seemed endless as the train sped through the darkness, each moment stretched taut with the weight of the unseen. Clara and the other passengers sat in tense silence, the journal and diary laid out before them like relics of a forgotten tragedy. The discovery of the haunted compartment had only deepened their resolve, but it had also heightened their fear. "We need to understand what the spirits want from us," Clara said, breaking the silence. "They're trying to communicate, to show us something important." Henry nodded. "We've already seen one ghost. There could be more. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next." As if in response to his words, the lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The temperature plummeted again, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. Clara felt a prickling on the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. A soft, mournful cry echoed through the carriage, sending a shiver down Clara's spine. She turned towards the sound, her heart pounding. Emerging from the shadows was a ghostly figure, a man in a tattered suit, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were hollow, filled with an indescribable sorrow. The apparition drifted closer, his gaze fixed on Clara. She felt a wave of cold wash over her, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The man's lips parted, and a whisper escaped, barely audible over the hum of the train. "Help! Us!" Clara's throat tightened. "How? What do you need us to do?" The ghost's form wavered, his expression one of desperate urgency. He pointed towards the window where the landscape had grown even more desolate. Clara followed his gesture, her eyes widening in shock. Outside, barely visible through the fog, was the faint outline of a cemetery, its gravestones crooked and overgrown. Before she could ask any more questions, the apparition vanished, leaving behind a profound sense of loss. Clara turned to the others, their faces pale and fearful. "We have to stop the train," she said urgently. "There's something out there they want us to see." Margaret nodded. "I'll find the conductor." As Margaret hurried off, Clara looked around at the other passengers. "We need to be ready for anything. The spirits are getting stronger." Henry took a deep breath. "Let's gather anything we might need. Flashlights, anything to keep warm. We don't know how long we'll be out there." As they prepared, Clara's mind raced. The cemetery held a key to the mystery, she was sure of it. But the journey to uncover the truth was fraught with danger, the spirit's desperation palpable. Margaret returned, the conductor in tow. His face was grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We'll stop at the next possible location," he said. "But be careful. This place, it's known for strange occurrences." The train began to slow, the screech of the brakes piercing the night. The passengers braced themselves, the anticipation almost unbearable. When the train finally came to a halt, the silence was deafening. Clara led the way as they disembarked, their breath visible in the cold night air. The cemetery lay ahead, shrouded in fog and mystery. The gravestones loomed like silent sentinels, each one a monument to the lives lost in the tragic accident. As they entered the cemetery, Clara felt the presence of the spirits all around them, a spectral audience watching their every move. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of lost voices urging them forward. Henry found a gravestone with a familiar name, matching one from the journal. "This is it," he said softly. "This is where it began." Clara knelt by the gravestone, tracing the name with her fingers. "What happened here? Why can't you find peace?" A sudden gust of wind blew through the cemetery, and Clara looked up to see the ghostly figures of the lost passengers emerging from the fog. They gathered around her, their eyes filled with a pleading desperation. "Help us," they whispered in unison, their voices a haunting echo. "Find the truth. Bring justice." Clara's heart ached with the weight of their sorrow. "We will," she promised. "We'll find out what happened and make it right." The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the night. But their presence lingered, a reminder of the unfinished business that bound them to the mortal realm. As the passengers made their way back to the train, Clara knew that their journey was far from over. The spectral encounters had revealed the depth of the tragedy, but the truth was still shrouded in mystery. The ghostly train would not rest until justice was served, and neither would they. The train began to move again, carrying them onward into the unknown. The passengers settled back into their compartments, their minds heavy with the weight of the night's revelations. They had seen the faces of the lost, heard their cries for help, and felt their pain. Clara lay awake, staring out the window at the passing darkness. The journey ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but she knew they had to see it through. The spirits depended on them, and they would not be abandoned again. As the train roared through the night, Clara vowed to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The ghostly train's journey had only just begun, and the horrors of the past were far from over. The train surged forward through the dark night, the recent spectral encounters leaving a palpable tension among the passengers. Clara, Margaret, Henry, and the others tried to get some rest, but sleep was elusive. The memories of the ghostly figures and their mournful pleas haunted their thoughts. Just as the first light of dawn began to hint at the horizon, a piercing scream shattered the silence. Clara jolted awake, heart pounding. She rushed out of her compartment and into the corridor, where a small group of passengers had gathered, their faces pale with fear. "It's Mrs. Parker!" a young man exclaimed, his voice trembling. "She's gone!" Clara pushed through the crowd to Mrs. Parker's compartment. The door was wide open, and inside the room was in disarray. The bedclothes were strewn about, and Mrs. Parker's suitcase lay open, its contents spilled across the floor. But there was no sign of Mrs. Parker herself. "Did anyone see anything?" Clara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The passengers shook their heads, their expressions reflecting their shared confusion and fear. Henry stepped forward, his face grim. "We need to search the train. She can't have gone far." They split into groups, scouring every carriage, but there was no trace of the missing woman. Clara's group combed through the rear carriages, opening every door, checking every compartment, but it was as if Mrs. Parker had simply vanished into thin air. As they regrouped in the dining car, Clara felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the fear palpable. "She wouldn't just disappear," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "Something must have taken her." Henry nodded. "It's the spirits. They're growing more desperate." Clara's thoughts raced. The spirits had communicated with them, shown them visions, but this was different. This was a direct, physical manifestation of their power. She looked around at the frightened faces of the other passengers, realizing they needed answers before more people disappeared. The conductor approached, his face pale and drawn. "We need to keep everyone together," he said. "We can't afford to lose anyone else." They gathered all the passengers in the dining car, creating a makeshift base of operations. Clara could see the fear in everyone's eyes, the uncertainty and dread weighing heavily on them. "We need to understand what the spirits want," Clara said. "If we can communicate with them, maybe we can find a way to stop this." As they huddled together, brainstorming ideas, the train lurched violently, throwing them off balance. The lights flickered, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. Clara felt the temperature drop suddenly, a chill seeping into her bones. A soft whisper echoed through the car, growing louder and more insistent. "Help us! find the truth." Clara looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere at once, a chorus of lost souls pleading for justice. "We need to go back to the compartment where we found the journal," Henry suggested. "There might be more clues there." Clara agreed, and they made their way back to the abandoned compartment, the whispers following them like an unseen shadow. The air grew colder as they approached, and Clara felt a tingling on the back of her neck. Inside the compartment, the journal and diary still lay on the desk, undisturbed. Clara picked up the journal, flipping through the pages, hoping for something she had missed. Suddenly, a photograph slipped out from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Henry picked it up, his eyes widening. This is Mrs. Parker." Clara took the photograph, her heart pounding. It was a picture of a group of passengers standing by the train, their faces bright with anticipation. Among them was Mrs. Parker, smiling warmly. "This must have been taken before the accident," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why would her photograph be here?" Clara's mind raced. "Maybe she has a connection to the original passengers. We need to find out more about her." As they pieced together the fragments of the past, Clara felt a growing sense of urgency. The spirits were trying to communicate, to show them the connections between the living and the dead. But time was running out, and the danger was increasing. "We have to find Mrs. Parker," Clara said firmly. "She's the key to understanding what happened." As they left the haunted compartment, Clara felt the weight of the spirit's presence more heavily than ever. The train continued its relentless journey through the night, carrying them deeper into the mystery. The vanishing of Mrs. Parker was a stark reminder of the stakes they faced, and Clara knew they had to uncover the truth before it was too late. With determination burning in her chest, Clara vowed to solve the mystery, to bring justice to the restless spirits and save Mrs. Parker. The ghostly train held its secrets tightly, but she was resolved to unlock them, no matter the cost. The dining car was filled with a tense silence as Clara and the other passengers pondered their next move. The vanishing of Mrs. Parker hung over them like a dark cloud, a grim reminder of the train's malevolent power. The conductor, his face ashen, stood at the head of the table, his hands trembling slightly. "We need answers," Henry said, breaking the silence. "You've been with this train for a long time. You must know something about its history." The conductor sighed deeply, his eyes reflecting years of burden. "I hoped it would never come to this," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "But I see now that the spirits will not rest until their story is told." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The accident happened 20 years ago. It was a tragedy that claimed many lives. I was a young conductor then, just starting out. The train derailed on a stormy night, much like tonight. The official report blamed it on faulty tracks, but there was more to it than that." Clara leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "There were rumors," the conductor continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Rumors of a man who had wronged the passengers, a man who was responsible for their deaths. The spirits believe that justice was never served. They believe that man is still out there." The passengers exchanged uneasy glances. "Who was this man?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. The conductor looked down, his face lined with sorrow. "His name was Richard Hayes. He was a wealthy businessman who had boarded the train that night. There were accusations that he had sabotaged the train to collect insurance money, but nothing was ever proven. The case was quietly closed, and Hayes disappeared shortly after." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think the spirits are looking for Hayes?" The conductor nodded. I believe so. They want justice for what happened to them. And until they get it, they will not rest. Henry spoke up, his voice determined. We need to find Hayes. If he's still alive, we need to bring him to justice. But how? Clara asked, her mind racing. We don't even know where to start. The conductor reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. This belonged to Hayes. I found it after the accident, but I never showed it to anyone. It contains his personal notes and records. Maybe it will lead us to him. Clara took the notebook, her hands shaking. Thank you, she said softly. We'll do our best to find him. As they pored over the notebook, they discovered a series of addresses and names, clues that might lead them to Richard Hayes. The entries were cryptic, filled with business dealings and coded messages, but they provided a starting point. We'll need to work quickly, Clara said, feeling a sense of urgency. The spirits are growing more desperate, and we can't afford to lose anyone else. The conductor nodded. I'll help you in any way I can. But be careful. The spirits are powerful, and they will stop at nothing to get what they want. As they continued their journey, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The train was a haunted vessel carrying the weight of its tragic past, and the spirits were growing more restless with each passing moment. Clara's resolve hardened. They had to find Richard Hayes to bring justice to the lost souls and end the curse that plagued the train. The conductor's secret had given them a direction, but the path ahead was fraught with danger. As the train sped through the night, Clara felt a renewed sense of determination. The ghostly train had become a battleground between the living and the dead, and she was ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. With the conductor's help, they would uncover the truth and bring peace to the restless spirits. The journey was far from over, but Clara knew they were getting closer to the answers they sought. The ghostly train held its secrets tightly, but they were unraveling the mystery, one step at a time. And with each revelation, they moved closer to ending the nightmare that haunted them all. The train hurtled through the night, the rhythmic clatter of its wheels a grim reminder of the relentless passage of time. Clara, Henry, Margaret, and the conductor pored over Richard Hayes' notebook in the dimly lit dining car. The pages were filled with cryptic notes and addresses, each one a potential clue in their quest to bring justice to the restless spirits. We need to decipher these entries, Henry said, his brow furrowed in concentration. There must be something here that can lead us to Hayes. Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the pages. This address, she said, pointing to a particularly worn entry. It's repeated several times. It must be important. The conductor leaned in, his finger tracing the address. That's in a nearby town. We can stop there and investigate. As the train approached the next station, the group prepared to disembark. The passengers were tense, their fear palpable. Clara felt a sense of urgency, knowing they had to move quickly. We'll need to split up, Clara said. Henry and I will go to the address. Margaret and the conductor can stay with the train and keep the passengers calm. Henry and Clara stepped off the train, the cold night air biting at their skin. The town was eerily quiet, the streets deserted. They followed the address in the notebook to a decrepit old house on the outskirts of town. The house loomed before them, its windows dark and empty. Clara felt a shiver of apprehension as they approached the front door. This is it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded, his expression grim. Let's hope we find some answers here. They pushed open the door, the hinges creaking ominously. Inside, the house was a time capsule filled with dusty furniture and faded photographs, Clara felt a sense of unease as they moved through the rooms, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows. In a study at the back of the house, they found a desk cluttered with papers and old documents. Clara rifled through them, her heart racing. "These are all about the accident," she said, her voice shaking. "Hayes must have been trying to cover his tracks." Henry picked up a faded newspaper clipping. "Look at this," he said, his eyes widening. "It's an article about the accident, but it mentions a witness who saw Hayes tampering with the tracks." Clara felt a surge of hope. This is it. This is the proof we need. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and a soft whisper echoed through the room. "Help us. Bring justice." Clara and Henry turned to see a ghostly figure standing in the doorway. It was Mrs. Parker, her eyes filled with sorrow and desperation. "We're trying," Clara said, her voice trembling. "We're going to bring Hayes to justice." Mrs. Parker's form wavered, her expression one of profound sadness. "Find him, before it's too late." As the apparition faded, Clara felt a renewed sense of urgency. They gathered the documents and hurried back to the train, their minds racing with the implications of their discovery. Back on the train, they shared their findings with Margaret and the conductor. "We have proof that Hayes was responsible for the accident," Clara said. "We need to find him and make him answer for what he did." The conductor nodded. "There's one more address in the notebook. It's in the next town. If Hayes is still alive, he might be there." The train resumed its journey, the tension among the passengers palpable. Clara felt a growing sense of determination. They were getting closer to the truth, but the spirits were growing more desperate. Time was running out. As they approached the next town, the conductor slowed the train to a halt. The group disembarked once more, following the final address in the notebook to a small, run-down apartment building. Inside, they found an elderly man sitting in a cluttered room, his face lined with years of guilt and regret. Richard Hayes looked up as they entered, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "You've come for me," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I knew this day would come." Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding. "The spirits of the passengers who died in the accident are seeking justice. They know what you did, and they won't rest until you answer for your crimes." Hayes's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant for it to happen," he said, his voice breaking. "I was desperate. I made a terrible mistake, and so many people suffered because of it." Henry's voice was stern. "You have to face the consequences of your actions. It's the only way to bring peace to the spirits." Hayes nodded, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his guilt. "I'll go with you. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." As they escorted Hayes back to the train, Clara felt a sense of relief. They had found the man responsible, and now they could finally bring justice to the restless spirits. The train began its final journey, the passengers watching in tense anticipation. Clara felt a sense of closure as they approached the site of the accident, the place where so many lives had been lost. As the train slowed to a halt, the air grew cold, and the whispers of the spirits grew louder. Clara stepped off the train, Hayes by her side, and faced the ghostly figures that emerged from the darkness. "We've brought him," she said, her voice steady. "He's here to answer for what he did." The spirits seemed to shimmer with a newfound peace, their eyes filled with gratitude. Mrs. Parker stepped forward, her ghostly form radiant with relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "We can finally rest." As the spirits began to fade, Clara felt a sense of profound relief. They had done it. They had brought justice to the lost souls, and ended the curse that had plagued the ghostly train. The train resumed its journey, carrying the passengers towards a new dawn. Clara felt a sense of hope as the first light of morning broke over the horizon. The nightmare was over, and the spirits had found peace. But as they traveled onward, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the journey had changed them all. The ghostly train had revealed the depths of human guilt and redemption, and she knew that the memory of their journey would stay with them forever. As the train rolled into the station, Clara felt a sense of closure. They had faced the horrors of the past and emerged stronger for it. The ghostly train's journey had ended, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them always. The morning light cast long shadows as the train approached the site of the tragic accident. The passengers were silent, the weight of the journey pressing down on them. Clara, Henry, Margaret, the conductor, and Richard Hayes stood together, united by the mission to bring peace to the restless spirits. The train slowed to a halt, and the air grew still. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as they disembarked. The landscape was eerily quiet, the remnants of the crash still visible in the twisted metal and scorched earth. The ghosts of the past lingered, their presence almost tangible. Hayes looked around, his face pale and drawn. "This is where it happened," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where I made the worst mistake of my life." The conductor stepped forward, his expression resolute. "We need to hold a ceremony. We need to show the spirits that justice is being served." As they gathered around the site of the accident, the air grew colder, and the whispers of the spirits intensified. Clara could feel their desperation, their need for closure. She took a deep breath and addressed the group. "We are here to acknowledge the tragedy that occurred, and to bring justice to those who lost their lives. Richard Hayes has confessed to his role in the accident and is ready to face the consequences of his actions." Hayes stepped forward, his hands shaking. "I am deeply sorry for what I did. I cannot undo the past, but I'm here to accept my punishment and to ask for your forgiveness." The air shimmered, and the ghostly figures of the passengers appeared, their eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. Mrs. Parker stepped forward, her form radiant in the morning light. "Your confession is a step towards justice," she said, her voice soft but clear. "But the pain and loss we endured cannot be erased. We need to know that our deaths were not in vain." Henry and Margaret stood by Clara's side, their expressions resolute. "We will ensure that the truth is known," Henry said. "We will make sure that Richard Hayes faces the full consequences of his actions." As the spirits gathered around Hayes, Clara felt a powerful sense of presence. The air was thick with emotion, the weight of the past pressing down on them all. She knew that this was the moment of reckoning, the final confrontation between the living and the dead. Suddenly, a fierce wind swept through the site, and the spirits began to waver, their forms flickering in the light. Clara felt a surge of fear, but she held her ground, determined to see the confrontation through. The spirits began to speak, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. "We seek justice. We seek peace." Hayes fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I am sorry," he cried. "I am so sorry." The wind howled, and the ground seemed to tremble. Clara felt the power of the spirits' anger and sorrow, their need for resolution. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "We acknowledge your pain and your loss. We vow to make sure that justice is served and that Richard Hayes answers for his crimes. Your deaths will not be forgotten." The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the light. Mrs. Parker's eyes met Clara's, filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. We can finally rest. As the last of the spirits disappeared, the wind died down, and the air grew still. Clara felt a profound sense of relief. They had done it. They had faced the final confrontation and brought peace to the restless souls. The group stood together, their faces reflecting the weight of the journey they had undertaken. The conductor stepped forward, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "We have brought justice to the spirits," he said, "but our work is not yet done. We must ensure that the truth is known and that the memory of those who died is honored." Clara nodded, her heart heavy but resolute. "We will," she said. "We owe it to them." As they boarded the train for the final leg of their journey, Clara felt a sense of closure. The ghostly train had been a vessel of tragedy and sorrow, but they had transformed it into a beacon of justice and redemption. The train rolled onward, carrying them towards a new dawn. Clara knew that the journey had changed them all, but it had also brought them closer together. They had faced the horrors of the past and emerged stronger for it. The final confrontation had ended, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them always. The ghostly train's journey was over, but its legacy would live on, a testament to the power of justice and the resilience of the human spirit. As the train rolled into the station, the passengers felt a collective sigh of relief. The once haunted carriages, filled with the echoes of tragedy and restless spirits, now carried a sense of peace. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm glow over the platform. Clara stepped off the train, her heart lighter than it had been in days. The other passengers followed, their faces reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The conductor, standing by the engine, tipped his hat to Clara and the others. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You helped bring peace to this train and its passengers. They can finally rest." Clara smiled, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. "We couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "Your knowledge and dedication were crucial." Henry and Margaret joined them, their expressions relieved. "It's over," Henry said softly. "We can finally move on." The passengers gathered on the platform, exchanging farewells. Bonds had been formed during their harrowing journey, and Clara knew they would carry these experiences with them forever. As the crowd began to disperse, she noticed a group of officials waiting at the edge of the platform. The conductor approached the officials, who had been informed of the situation and were ready to take Richard Hayes into custody. Hayes stepped forward, his face resigned. "I'm ready to face the consequences," he said quietly. One of the officials nodded. "We'll ensure that justice is served." As Hayes was led away, Clara felt a sense of closure. The man responsible for the tragedy would finally answer for his actions, and the spirits of the lost passengers could rest in peace. The train, once a vessel of sorrow, had become a symbol of redemption and justice. Clara turned to the conductor. "What will happen to the train now?" The conductor smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "It will be decommissioned. Its journey is over. But its story will be remembered, and the lessons we've learned will not be forgotten." As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden light over the station, Clara felt a sense of hope for the future. The nightmare of the ghostly train was over, but the impact of their journey would linger in their hearts. Henry and Margaret approached, and Henry extended his hand. "Thank you, Clara, for everything." Clara shook his hand warmly. "We did this together. I couldn't have done it without you." Margaret smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Take care, Clara. I hope our paths cross again someday." As they parted ways, Clara felt a bittersweet pang. The bonds they had formed would always remain, even as they returned to their separate lives. She watched as the passengers dispersed, each carrying the memory of their journey and the lessons they had learned. The station grew quiet as the train was prepared for its final journey to the rail yard. Clara stood on the platform, watching as the train, once a vessel of horror, now represented the power of redemption and justice. As she walked away from the station, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had changed her, deepening her understanding of the human spirit's resilience and the importance of seeking justice. The ghostly train story had come to an end, but its legacy would live on. Clara knew she would carry the memories of the journey with her always, a reminder of the power of courage and determination in the face of fear. The dawn of redemption had arrived, and with it, the promise of a brighter future. As she stepped into the warmth of the morning sun, Clara smiled, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the lessons of the ghostly train would guide her always. The nightmare was over, and the dawn of a new chapter in her life had begun.